Well, hello, everyone. This is Sandy Mason, and I'm going to be with you for the next hour or so. We're going to be talking about moth orchids. You should be seeing the slide that talks about the 2017 winter webinar series, so hopefully you are ready to go. So just to introduce you to me, I'm Sandy Mason. For about 30-some years, I was with the University of Illinois Extension as a horticulture educator, and just the last couple of months, I've been the State Master Gardener Coordinator, so I'm really excited to be a part of that group statewide. So welcome to everybody for this program today. And so what we're going to talk about today is this whole idea of orchids, right? And orchids are really one of those things that I think they just look so exotic, don't they? They're almost mysterious and bizarre, and because the flowers themselves are just so intricate. And so when we look at a bunch of orchids like this that are for sale, maybe easy to grow really isn't the first thing we think of. But hopefully after today, I can encourage you to think about at least one orchid that you may decide to go ahead and grow. And if you look at these orchids, I think the one thing that's so exciting about them is just the fact that, you know, they are, if you just look at these few orchids here, these different types of orchids, they're just, we have to always keep in mind the fact that orchids are really the most highly evolved flowers on the earth. So no wonder they have these very intricate-looking flowers. And the reason they have these intricate-looking flowers is that they are trying to attract certain pollinators. And with orchids, they're often a very singular pollinator. It might be just one species of moth or bee or whatever it is. And that's one of the reasons why they're so intricate, that they have these amazing combinations and these pollination syndromes where they rely on very specific insects in order to pollinate them. And so we get the benefit of all that by looking at these great plants. And if we really also think about, you may always think about orchids as being something that only grows in the jungles or places like that, but you might be surprised to know that the orchids are an amazingly diverse plant family, and they'll grow in deserts and mountains and marshes, even northern woods, and even in Illinois forests. Now, we're not going to have ones that look like this, but we do have orchids ourselves, even in Illinois and the Midwest. So that's actually pretty darn exciting in my mind. And probably the other thing when we think about orchids is just the thing that probably a lot of people are thinking that orchids are kind of plant divas, as in that, you know, they're just so sophisticated and they're going to be so demanding with their growing conditions, and there's no possible way I can really get into having these kind of plants just because they are so just amazingly demanding. And I think that's one of those things that we just kind of have to set aside a little bit for now, at least, because certainly with the amazing diversity that we have out there, there's over 20,000 some species of orchids and probably another 100,000 hybrids of orchids out there. So we know there's lots of orchids there. And we might often think that we have to have years and years of experience when it comes to orchids. But really one of the things that really brought me to this topic is that, you know, okay, number one, I don't claim to be an orchid expert, not by any means. I know a lot of times when we're at the university, we give these programs, and it's because it's something we've studied or we've done research on or whatever. And really this came about as just the fact that I was just one of those people that really had some interest in orchids, and I wasn't always terribly happy with the results. So I'm really sort of here to sort of share some of the things that I've learned. But if you're really getting into a lot of these different types of orchids, I'd really recommend the orchid societies that are around the country. And I think just knowing those folks that are into orchids and the different species that they may be experts on. So go to the American Orchid Society. I think that's a great place to go. You can go to their website at aos.org and just find the orchid society near you, and I think you'll just, you know, connect with them. And it's also a great way to get plants. So I will mention that too. So remember to keep those kind of things in mind as well. So we're going to talk about today is really this idea of a moth orchid. And I consider myself, you know, I've been a gardener as well as a professional horticulture for many years. I've got a lot of gardening success, I would say, under my belt. I've also killed a few plants, but I feel like I know a little bit about growing plants. But it really was one of those things that I thought I had these moth orchids, and I just felt like I really wasn't they're supposed to be so easy to grow, and they're always listed as one of the easiest orchids to grow, but I just really felt like they weren't happy plants. And so what was I doing wrong? So that was one of the things that really came about with this particular program, is that I finally realized why my moth orchids were just doing okay but not great. And so this program really comes about from me having these sort of aha moments as, oh, that's why they're not doing well. So I kind of feel like I've been through some of this. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So, okay, so this is Phalaenopsis. This is one of those things that is called a moth orchid, and so Phalaenopsis is how we say the genus name. And you can see why they're called moth orchids, because they really do look like this sort of flock of these fluttering moths sort of dancing on these arching stems, and so it just totally makes sense. And most of the time you're going to find these in white or pink or purple, yellow perhaps, and often in combinations. And I think the other fun thing about orchids is that many times they have this different veining, like you'll see in the one picture here on the right, as well as even blotching. And of course there's plenty of hybrids of different species within the Phalaenopsis or with Phalaenopsis. So I think that's also the beauty. I don't think you never have too many orchids, maybe. I don't think so. Okay. So one of the things to look at here is also just the fact, like, why would you want to have orchids? And I think the amazing thing about orchids is that I think the leaves are pretty. I can't say that with all orchids, but I think with moth orchids, they do have some really nice, very attractive sort of glossy green leaves. But to me, the beauty of the flowers is just the fact that they last so long. I mean, they will last literally for months. And I've had some in my office, and people think they're made out of wax. Eventually they come in and they go, is that made out of wax? It's been flowering forever. And that's just how they are. They just have these amazingly long-term flowers themselves that last for a long time. And then just the fact that the stem itself will have multiple flowers. So if they're happy plants, they can bloom for months. So it really is one of those things that even if they never flowered again, I would still be happy. I would still feel like my money was well spent. But to me, one of the great things about being a gardener is that you really get the satisfaction of getting these back into bloom. When they get them back into bloom, you think like, yeah, I've finally made it. So that's really what we're going to talk about today, is not only just enjoying these plants, but also just the fact, okay, how can we get these back into bloom? And so one of the things is, and this really was part of my aha moment, is that I really wasn't paying attention to these moth orchids, or even many of the other orchids that we have are really what are called epiphytes. And so for most of us, certainly in the Midwest, but for most of us, we're dealing generally with plants that live in the soil, right? They live in soil. Well, these plants don't live in the soil. They're epiphytes. They're called air plants. And these are truly tree-hugging plants. So these moth orchids are actually native to Asian jungles, where they hang on to, rocks and trees with these very long, sort of thick roots, and they gather their moisture from just the rain and the dew and the humidity, and then the nutrients from decaying leaves or any kind of other debris that sort of accumulates among their roots. So they're hanging off these trees. They're not growing in the soil. So that was one of my big aha moments, is I got to quit treating these plants as though they live in the soil, because they don't. That's not how they've evolved over time, and that's not when they're happy. So you can see the pictures here you can see the flower spike, as well as these very kind of succulent looking roots where they hang on to either rocks or often to trees. And then, of course, is just the fact that I think it's interesting now that we're not really going to find them in the jungles necessarily, or hanging off of trees, but I have seen them in Florida or certain parts of the country where people go ahead and actually tie these to trees, and they end up hanging off of trees. But anymore, these moth orchids in particular, you find them next to the lumber and the nails and the apples and the lettuce. They're in the big box stores, and certainly in grocery stores when you first walk in, there they are. So I think that's the other thing that's great about these plants, is that generally you can get them fairly inexpensively, and they're readily available. So you can really have a lot of fun with collecting a lot of different ones. I will tell you that sometimes you'll see these very intensely sort of unnaturally blue-colored moth orchids. in certain times of the year, but I will tell you, don't get too terribly attached to that blue color because those particular flowers have actually been dyed, and so any future flowers from those plants are going to be white. So those unnatural looking blue flowers, sorry, those aren't going to hang out. You can enjoy the flowers while you can, but then as they rebloom, they're definitely going to be white. So, but I like the white ones too. But it'd be fun to have blue ones, but I don't know if we're going to have that anytime soon. So my other aha moment was just the fact that because these plants are actually growing, on trees or rocks or whatever, is that they really are what I would call snackers. When they drink, when they get their nutrients, I think most of the time when we deal with plants as gardeners, we think about plants either indoors or outdoors as almost like gorgers. We water them once a week. They sort of gorge on water, and maybe we fertilize them every week or every month or whatever. So they sort of gorge on all these water and nutrients. They kind of fill up their tanks, and then they use the surplus until the next fill up, until we water them or fertilize them again. Or where moth orchids are very much, again, so this air plant, and they're really snackers. They really prefer a very steady sort of drip of water as opposed to this sort of deluge or small doses of nutrient, and really small doses of nutrients rather than all the surplus nutrient that we often do within our soil type plants. So to me, that was the other big thing, is let's treat them as just sort of snackers or snacking on a regular basis rather than just gorging. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of get into some basic maintenance things when it comes to water, light, and nutrients when it comes to moth orchids, because that's always a good place to start, right? And so just what I was mentioning before is just the fact that these are plants that are sippers. So it was one of those things you don't, and that's probably what most people end up doing, is that they overwater their moth orchids. Because again, we're back to that. We're used to doing that sort of, letting the plant sort of gorge on water. The soil would sort of fill up with water, and the rest of it would drain out, and then everybody's happy. Whereas orchids, these moth orchids, are really much happier if they have this sort of constant moisture, but not a lot of standing water. So the big thing I would say is, since most people have a tendency to overwater, is that if you really don't know whether you need to water, then I would wait. When it comes to the moth orchids, and really kind of go from there and get your indicators really from the plant itself. And I would say it really is one of those things. Garden writer Roger Swain once said, and I've always remembered this, is that good gardeners are just better waterers. Because there really is an art to watering, knowing when to water, when not to water, understanding what the plant's needs are, and just kind of going from there. So you'll eventually learn on how these plants are growing. And again, they're hanging on to trees. They're waiting for the moisture, dew, those kinds of things. And they're not, it's not this, torrential downpour where the soil gets infiltrated, and like we typically think of with a lot of our plants. The other thing to sort of keep in mind with these moth orchids is just the fact that the roots are actually able to photosynthesize. And so we don't think about that. So when you water your moth orchid, what you'll see is that the healthy roots will actually turn green when they're watered. And then they'll go back to white when they're starting to dry out. So that's just perfectly normal if the roots turn green. And actually we kind of like to see that. The other thing that I learned is, I always say decorative pots and all these kind of things, is that one of the things is, and I'm actually going to talk more about my orchid guru of Mitzi Williams, I'll mention her, is that she really has taught me a lot when it comes to orchids. And one of the things that she said is that it really does help to have these clear plastic orchid pots. Because if you're like me, you've often had other kinds of pots, and whether they're black or some kind of ceramic or something, where you don't see the roots. Well, it'll help you immensely if you use these clear plastic orchid pots. You can easily see the health of the roots. You can see if the roots are green, then they don't need water. The white roots, maybe it might be time to water, but you just have a much better indicator of the health of the roots and therefore the health of the plant. So that's key number one. The key thing I would say is that use these plastic orchid pots. So I think that'll help immensely and give you a much better idea. So the other thing, not only are we seeing these kind of blue plants, the other thing that you often see with these moth orchids is actually to water them with ice cubes. And it'll come on the label and all that kind of stuff. And I totally understand the concept of using ice cubes because, again, it goes back to that whole, which I was mentioning before, is that, these moth orchids are, they're sippers. They want a little bit of water. So if you put an ice cube there, of course, it's this sort of, as the ice cube melts, you get this little bit of moisture over time. And so, okay, it sounds like a good idea, right? But we also have to remember that these plants are native to the Asian jungles. Cold water is really not their preference. So I would say if you truly feel like you want to go the ice cube method, that's fine. But I would say don't use it because it really isn't what the plants want. It's not what they're going to see. So don't use ice cubes. If you truly feel like you're going to be gone or you just feel like you have to, that's fine. But try to stay away from that if you can. So we'll forget the ice cubes. So that's a little bit about watering. The other thing is that I think can also help plants immensely, or these moth orchids immensely, is that they do like bright light, but not really direct light. So it's too much light. Sometimes it actually burn the foliage. I'll show you some pictures later on that. Too little light, they may not grow as well, or you may not have any flowers. Ideally, the east window is just great because you get that bright morning sunlight, and then by afternoon, and then of course then we don't have those issues with just being too hot and really just too much sun. So if you can have a bright east window, that's ideal. Now, granted, not everybody can do that. If you have even like a shaded western or even southern window, that actually can be fine too. North windows actually get to be a little bit tough because it's often just not enough light. And so you may find that you're going to have some kind of supplemental lighting if you have a north window. I would almost bet, really think about some kind of supplemental light. Orchids can certainly be taken outdoors in the summertime, but make sure that you want to make sure you don't want the temperature to be much below 50 degrees. And certainly, just during the summertime itself, but make sure that they're shaded either by a tree or some other structure or something, so they don't get any of that direct sunlight outdoors. And then certainly bring them indoors before the temperature drops much below 50 degrees. So you certainly can take them outside for a nice little vacation. And also, I think the thing, we often do this anyways, gardeners, we look at the leaves, right, to give us a better idea of kind of the overall health of the plant. And so certainly moth orchids are no different. The healthy leaves should look kind of an olive green color. So you can kind of see it in these pictures. These are probably actually more pictures of ones that have gone wrong. If it's really like super dark green leaves, you may actually find that it's just a little bit too much, not enough light, so the light might be a little bit too low. So we like that olive green, not so much the super dark green leaves. If you're getting sunburn or even red tinged, like we're seeing here in these pictures, it may be a really good indicator if it just got too much light, either because it was outdoors or maybe you had it in a southerly window and just got too much light. The other thing I will say is, and you can kind of see that on the right-hand picture here, is just the fact that these particular leaves here is just the fact that, they will age over time. So the lower leaves will age over time. It's perfectly normal for those lower leaves as they get more top growth. Those lower leaves will just naturally start to turn kind of a yellow color and then drop off. So that's perfectly normal. We're probably seeing that on this one leaf where it's just getting older, whereas this one, the other one, is probably getting just a little bit too much light. So just realize that eventually the leaves do fade away as they get more new growth. So just what I was mentioning before, it's always a good idea that you may have to think about some kind of supplemental lighting, but just to realize it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Even if it's just like a reading light or something like that, you may find it works out fine. You don't necessarily have to go into big light fixtures, but certainly fluorescent lights or anything along those lines can certainly help. So just any kind of little bit of extra light, and just give the plants, if you're getting that dark green leaf color, maybe you just decide it's time to go ahead and add a little bit of light. So look at the plant, see how it's growing, and then go from there on whether you really feel like you need some more light on these plants. The other thing is, again, we're thinking about that jungle, right? That Asian jungle where these plants have come from. They do like a higher humidity, although moth orchids in particular are much more forgiving. Now, when you get into some of the other orchids, they're not as forgiving when it comes to humidity, but moth orchids do pretty well in our winter homes, even though it can be quite dry. So if you can, use a humidifier or even something like what this picture shows, where you're actually using kind of this little pebble tray and you actually put water in where those kind of marbles are, keep a little bit of water in there, and then as that evaporates, kind of helps to raise the humidity. And actually orchids do very well in terrariums, so you may decide you want to go that route as well. But if you can raise the humidity a little bit, you'll find that that's good. But again, moth orchids, much more forgiving, so we like that part. Now, when it comes to fertilization, certainly orchids are one of those that appreciates a good fertilization periodically. But we, again, thinking about as being gardeners, is that we typically would think of regular fertilization, certainly during their growing season. And as with most plants we think of with orchids, is that they really need more fertilization during those periods of sort of active leaf growth. And for moth orchids, typically that would be kind of in the spring and summer, and then not so much fertilization when it comes to their flowering period. And for moth orchids, it'd be more of that kind of late fall, winter time. So that kind of gives you an idea. But I think orchids are definitely one of those, is that if you can give them some fertilizer, you will benefit. You'll actually see better flowering, better leaf growth, all those kind of things. But we always have to remember that, again, we're back to that, the whole thing of these particular orchids is just the fact that they're snackers. So if you tend to be one of those people that tends to kind of over-fertilize things, just sort of keep that in mind, and probably less fertilizer is better than too much. So I would say that on all plants, but particularly with orchids, they're really going to be susceptible to over-fertilization. So, and someone told me one time, just think weekly. So we're going to be fertilizing a week fertilization weekly. So if you can think of weekly, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that, but just at least kind of keep that in mind, is that you're going to use these week fertilizer rates. And again, it depends on what kind of fertilizer that you're going to be using, of course. And so this is what we might see. Typically with orchid fertilizers, you're going to see them, they tend to be higher in calcium and magnesium, which is good. You may find that that's going to work out fine. And I would, to me, this was kind of that other kind of, I guess, aha moment, is sort of understanding a little bit more about how these plants are actually getting their nutrients. Again, as a typical gardener, I'm used to plants that are growing in soil, and we have to think about soil, of course, just naturally has a lot of nutrients in it. We don't have to add a lot of nutrients, typically on halfway decent soil. Plants are getting a lot of just nutrients, and so we can get away with maybe not fertilizing things. But we think about with these moth orchids, the kind of mix that they're in, the kind of bark mix and charcoal and things, it's not soil. So it doesn't have this sort of backup when it comes to nutrients like we would typically think of with soil. So that was kind of my other aha moment, is that, oh, these aren't in soil. I really have to think a little bit more about how I'm fertilizing, how much I'm fertilizing, those kind of things. And so you can get away with different ones here. You can see probably typically, in the fall and winter when they're actually blooming, you're going to be maybe fertilizing less. And maybe higher in that second number, the phosphorus. So just sort of keep you in mind. But I think it's definitely one of those that's nice to go ahead and get a fertilizer that's truly meant for orchids. I think it's worth it. And so as far as just the active growth, what I mentioned before is that this would be the time where we're going to be doing more leaf growth, when they're spring and summer, more leaf growth. And so typically we would think of more in that first number, so more nitrogen. And this was actually through a University of Illinois study, and what they found was a fourth of the recommended rate every third watering. So depending on how often you're watering, every third watering, they'd actually fertilize a fourth of the recommended rate. And then during the flowering period, of course, we're thinking more of phosphorus, that second number, and less nitrogen. And so in that same study, they were actually recommending a fourth of the recommended rate every 3 weeks. So you're really going to stretch out your time period there when it comes to fertilizing. So that kind of gives you, that's a little bit more detail, but if you can sort of think of weekly, that's one way to sort of at least keep it in mind on a little bit on what you're thinking of, or what we're thinking of. Okay, just again, sort of kind of wrapping up just a little bit what we're thinking about with some of the basic maintenance things. When it comes to water and nutrients, we're thinking of sips and snacks. So, my kind of eating, right? Sips and snacks. And then that east window, bright indirect light. So the plant should look, pretty much like this, kind of that nice kind of olive greeny color. And then you can see there's a new leaf coming out the top. So this is the kind of thing we like to see where it's continuing to grow and we're getting some good leaf growth on it. Okay, the other thing is not just the basic maintenance kinds of things, but there is a time when you need to repot, and this is something I learned from my orchid mentor, is kind of understanding when it's time to repot, because this is another one of those that to me is not intuitive. If you're, I guess I'll call us soil gardeners, if we were a soil gardener, some of this sort of repotting and when to repot and how you repot is just not intuitive to me. So, and I don't think I'm the only one that thinks that way, but at any rate, so that is one of those things to sort of keep in mind. This was kind of my other aha moment. So when we think about repotting, typically we probably do this in the spring, usually around May after they're finished flowering. And how often? Well, that's like with a lot of plants. It depends on how much root growth you've had, also how much the bark has deteriorated in the planter itself or in the pot itself, because bark deterioration, again, if you're a soil gardener, we're thinking, oh, good, it's deteriorating, it's sort of turning into compost or whatever, that's a good thing. Well, that's not necessarily a good thing when it comes to moth orchids. You really don't want the bark to deteriorate too much. If it's starting to get this kind of crumbly kind of look to it, to the bark, it really is time to repot. Because one of the reasons for that is just the fact that if it's a real crumbly like that, it tends to stay way too wet. And then, again, the roots get overwatered, and then you're sort of back to some issues. So to me, that was not, again, didn't seem intuitive to me. It seemed a little counterintuitive that, that once it starts to decompose, maybe it's time to repot. So it could be every 1 to 3 years. It really, again, sort of depends on how well it's growing. So the other thing, of course, is just the fact that when we're looking at our plants, and this was, okay, time to repot, when the roots start growing out of the pot. Now, this was my other thing. So I'm thinking these plants I'm telling you all the things that I learned by doing it the wrong way. I'm thinking, this is why it's supposed to grow, right? They grow on trees, and so the roots are supposed to start coming out of the pot. Well, the problem is once the roots start coming out of the pot like that, it becomes harder and harder and harder to keep those roots moist, of course. And so even though we see this and how they grow, it makes it much harder to keep them watered correctly. So when you start seeing that, you can see here on this one picture here to the right, you can see that this is one of the new roots coming out. So it's actually starting to, so all these roots are out there drying out, and that's really not what we want to see with these. Even though that's the way they grow in trees, it works out fine in the tree, not so much when it comes to the pots. So when they start looking like this, it's time to repot. The other thing is if you really start to see these sort of leathery, kind of wrinkled leaves. And this was one of those things. Again, I had this is one of my plants. Okay, I'll admit it, this is one of my plants. And I'm looking at these wrinkly leaves, and I'm looking online, I'm trying why are these leaves so wrinkled? I just don't understand it. I think I must need to water them more. So I was just overwatering them is what it ended up being. And Mitzi, my guru, orchid guru, walked in one day, and she just looked at him and says, it needs to be repotted. So she knew right away what it was, is because all those roots were coming out of the pot. I really wasn't able to water correctly, and so you start getting these leathery, sort of wrinkled leaves. So this is another good indicator. Again, looking at the leaves, is it time to repot? Sure. Something like this, absolutely, it's time to repot. The other time to think about repotting is that often these moth orchids are in these decorative containers with sphagnum moss. And so this is another one of those is it's time to repot. I know this looks pretty because people like them and I see the roots and, it's a nice decorative container like this. But the problem is sphagnum moss just stays way too wet. And so if you get an orchid that is in a container like this with a sphagnum moss, maybe enjoy it certainly while it's flowering, but I definitely think of as soon as you possibly can actually change, get it out of there and at least change the potting medium to bark mix instead of sphagnum moss. So you could use the same container, although I would wonder, I have a feeling this probably has no hole in the bottom or anyway. So this actually gets to be a hard container to use. But just to realize you need to get the sphagnum moss away from the roots. It's way too wet, and then really think about putting bark mix around them. So they look good for a while. It's time to, move on from there. So the other thing, this is sort of the repotting process. So the first thing is to cut off the old flower spike. Now, what you can do is actually, if it's a halfway healthy plant, if you want to go ahead and leave 1 or 2 nodes on that flower spike, sometimes with healthy plants, they'll actually go ahead and reflower. They'll send out a new arching stem. So if you may want to go ahead and leave 1 or 2 nodes, and then within 8 to 12 weeks, you might actually have another another flowering stem. So that's pretty cool. So that's up to you, but you can certainly go ahead and do that, and certainly on healthy plants, you might want to go ahead and do that. Now, I will tell you, mine were actually going ahead and we're still flowering at this time, and I know I keep picking on my orchid guru, but she said, go ahead and cut them off. We need to be repotted. Use that spike, put it in a flower arrangement, something, but just we need to get these on the right cycle so that they can go ahead and flower in the fall and winter instead of just flowering all the time. So I did it was tough. I had to go ahead and cut those off, but that's okay. She assured me it was all going to be fine. She was all going to be fine. Okay. So the other thing is just sort of a reminder about the roots is that these actually roots are very sort of succulent, and they're very brittle and actually can be easily broken. So one of the things you can certainly do is before you repot them is to just make sure they're well watered, or in this case you might actually even take them out of the pot and just just let them sit there in water for a little bit to sort of rehydrate if it just seems like they're really dry, and then just be really gentle with them so you're not breaking off the roots, because they are just amazingly thick and what I would say is also brittle. So here are some supplies that you're going to need when it's time to repot. And so just small shears and just a small jar of alcohol. This is just a good way to just make sure you don't have any kind of disease issues from, just actually either from one plant to another or actually within the plant itself. So you just want to dip the shears in alcohol before each cut, and that's just a good habit to get into. And that's probably a good habit for a lot of plants, but this is one of the things you can do. The other thing is that you may not realize is that you really want to go ahead and wear either rubber or latex gloves when you repot those, because the bark mix itself, actually you can get splinters from the bark mix. So it's just a good way to protect your hands from that. And then certainly an orchid mix, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also some kind of a bucket or pan so you can soak that orchid bark mix ahead of time, because you want to make sure it's nice and well hydrated before you repot the orchids. And then, of course, a dish pan to dip your plants, as I showed before, and then certainly a container, some kind of newspapers or something to collect the old mix. And then also, if you can, have an assorted size of these different plastic orchid pots and those clear plastic pots, because you really don't know which size until you really get in there and start repotting. So if you can have kind of a mix of sizes, assorted sizes, that's really going to help you a lot as well. And so the orchid mix, when you buy them, this is another thing that I learned, because, of course, Mitzi sends me to the store to get some mix, and they didn't have orchid mix, they had bark. Well, what you really want is what's called orchid mix, because it does have this what's either aged fir or pine bark, but it also has some calcined clay and then typically some charcoal, maybe perlite, a few other things in it. So it's truly a mix and not just the bark. You can use the orchid bark, obviously, and then add other things to it, but it's best just to go ahead and make sure you get orchid mix. So, live and learn, right? The other thing is now you're going to go ahead and gently remove the plant from the pot. I had these decorative, again, so I always think I'm doing all the right thing, right? I had these decorative pots, and you've seen several pictures of those that actually have holes in them, And so, of course, the roots started growing out the holes, which makes it very difficult to repot them. So those orchid pots, they look nice, but it makes it harder to repot. So you'd really want to gently remove the plant from the pot, is what I'm doing here. And then dip the plant in a pan of water, again, sort of hydrate the roots. And then at that point, you can really start looking at the plant and the roots itself. You can sort of look at those roots, remove any kind of decayed potting mix or sphagnum moss. This is really sort of the cleanup time, is to go ahead and hydrate the roots and then just clean up anything that maybe really want to get it all off, all the old bark mix and all that kind of stuff. And then you're going to go ahead and evaluate the roots. And this is just one of those things you just kind of have to go through and check them. Again, you want to make sure that you dip the shears in alcohol before each cut, and then you're just going to gently go through and cut off any dead or decayed, broken pieces. And really how you're going to tell is the ones that are dead are, they feel squishy and they're often flat, is what I found. They're dark, flat, so they should look nice and white and plump. And so you kind of have to keep following. They could be really long roots, and you may have all these even branches on them. And so you just kind of have to gently go through and figure out how much you need to get rid of. Or you may find maybe you've done a really good job of watering, and you really hasn't. You don't need to do much in the way of trimming them at all. I found I had a lot of sort of dead roots that had just probably been overwatered. So it just takes a moment and just a perfect time to go through and decide from there what you need to keep. You're also going to remove any kind of the shriveled or brown leaves that are on there. Again, you sort of have to think about it. Is this, if it's just a little bit yellow, you might want to leave it on. If it truly looks like it's about ready to go, it's time to take it off. Probably the other big thing to keep in mind is you really want to remove any leaves that are emerging from below the roots, because they will send out these roots. Again, these are plants that live on trees, so they'll actually go ahead and send out roots that are actually above some of the leaves. But when you repot them, that makes it very difficult. So just go ahead and remove any of the leaves that emerge from below the roots. And that's kind of what I'm pointing at there, is just the fact that there's actually a new root that's coming out. So we're going to remove some of those lower leaves to make sure that we can go ahead and repot it properly. Because otherwise you end up having the pot just set way too much out of the bark mix. So you really kind of have to get the leaves down there so you can repot it properly at the right depth. So the other thing is this idea of sort of determining the new pot size. So this was my other sort of aha moment here, is just the fact that because, again, I'm a gardener, right? And so I always think of that I just had this natural instinct to use these bigger pots, right? You're repotting it, you need to put it in a bigger pot, right? So the plant will get bigger. That's what we do with our, soil-borne plants, right? Well, that's not the case with these orchids. Is that you really need to look at, once you've done all your trimming, don't pay any attention to the leaves, the size of the leaves and how much leaf mass you have. Really look at the root mass. So you may end up actually using the same pot that you had before, or the same size pot. You might even have a smaller pot, because you really want the roots to be tight inside that pot. And again, that was another thing that just wasn't instinctual for me. I thought it should be a big pot, lots of bark mix, but you really don't want it to do that with these guys. So that's the other big thing, is to really think about it. And Mitzi kept putting them in these small pots that I just thought, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she's putting them in these little bitty pots. They just seem like way, way, way too little. But I trust her, and I know she knows what she's doing. So it's better to be, her thought was also, and I agree with this, is that better to be too small than too large. So that's the other big thing, is that, so if you have to really stuff the roots in there along with the bark mix, that's just fine. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. So it's better to have a too small a pot than too big a pot. And if you are going to use these double pots, this is what I was mentioning with these orchid pots that have these holes in them. And, it makes sense, right? Because you get a lot of, air penetration and everything seems to make sense. But it just makes it so hard to repot them. So it's really is much easier if you're going to use any kind of decorative container to do this, where you use those clear plastic orchid pots inside the decorative pot. And again, that way you can pull them out. You can, if you need to soak them in the sink or whatever, and then you can see exactly what's going on with the roots as well. So if you can use those or have those available to you, that helps immensely. So have the right pots. I think that helps. So the other thing certainly too is and now that we've sort of decided on the pot, it's time to go ahead and add the orchid mix to the root mass. And you're really kind of twisting the plant in the pot and just stuffing the moist bark mix, because remember we went ahead and soaked this, and just stuffing it into the pot. And literally with your fingers just stuffing them into the pot, so you're going to have this mass of roots as well as potting mix. And so that, again, is another one of those, I just felt like, oh, these poor things, I'm just stuffing them way too heavy, but, that's okay. And you can see on this particular plant, even though it looks like it had a little bit of sun scald, if I'd taken off those leaves, it really would have left it with not a whole lot of leaves. So sometimes you just go ahead and leave some of these on, even though it may not be the best thing, and you may find that you're going to remove these later. But that's just one of those judgment calls that sometimes you just have to decide on whether you're going to leave the leaves or not. So, okay, what's the big test on how do you know if you've repotted? So this is my guru here on the right. This is Mitzi Williams. And you should be able, this is a repot test. You should be able to hold the plant by the leaves and raise it in the air, and the pot should stay secure. And you can see that I'm just totally believing this, right? I'm thinking, this is just going to fall out. But it didn't, and that's exactly how it should be. So again, sort of forget those instincts about having bigger pots, not stuffing the roots in there, all those kind of things, and just realize that this actually works quite well. So I believe it now, even though in this picture it didn't look like I believed it too much. And so after repotting, you're going to go ahead and place the plant in the east window or some similar place. After about 2 to 3 days, then you'd really want to start your sort of watering, because you should have, the bark mix should be plenty moist, that you shouldn't have to water right away. Again, sort of not instinctual, right? We always think we should water as soon as we repot. Not with these guys. We've already moistened our bark mix, and so you don't really have to do that. But after a couple of days, then you want to go ahead and start with the water and nutrients and continue from there to get it going. And then hopefully you see it like this, where you actually see some new growth coming out, and then you'll know that everything's working out really well. Now, when it comes to other thing, when it comes to even just the schedule, so now we've repotted it. Typically, again, we're going to do this in May, probably the springtime. And then when it comes to the summer, then after we've repotted them, we're really concentrating on trying to get some new leaves growing, because that's really that's what's going to give us great flowering come fall and winter. So you got to have a healthy plant to have healthy flowering. So to me, I don't, some people don't think these are all that terribly attractive. I just think they're really interesting, and as far as that goes, I think the leaves are pretty fun. Now, some people go ahead and they might put these in a different area, so you don't necessarily have to look at these on a regular basis, but you put them in the sort of the holding pattern, and then bring them out once they go ahead and flower, and you may decide that you want to go that route, but I think these are kind of pretty anyway. And then when it comes to flowering and reflowering, because that's the whole idea, right? The foliage is okay, but the beauty of this is actually getting these plants to rebloom. So they certainly can be one of those things that you don't have to sort of throw them on the compost pile. You can get them to rebloom, but typically when you buy them, they're going to be purchased in flower. So, and then you can sort of, when they're in bloom, you can move them about the house and really enjoy the flowers at that point. So that's really kind of the fun thing, too, to go ahead and decorate with them while they're in flower. So don't think about throwing them in the compost pile. I don't know how many times I've heard this. People just sort of either give them to somebody else or they throw them in the compost pile. But they are one of the easiest orchids to reflower. So that's the good news when it comes to moth orchids. And part of it is just having just some of these ideas of what the basics are what it is to get these things to reflower. And I should have showed in that last picture. You can see this is actually the flower stalk coming out. So when you start seeing that, it's like, aha, that's great. It'll make you feel really good. So the big thing when it comes to flowering with the moth orchids is just the fact that they bloom when they have this difference between the night temperatures and the day temperatures for at least 2 weeks. So typically when they're going to sort of come into bloom is when the night temperatures are about 15 degrees cooler than the daytime temperatures for at least that 2-week period. So typically late summer, early fall is a really good time, because normally, again, if you have them outdoors, this is when it's going to be happening anyway. We're going to start getting those differences in daytime temperatures and evening temperatures. And so what ideally, what you'd like to see is about 70 degrees during the day with about a 55-degree night. You can see there's a little bit of range there, so you can still get them into flower if that's not necessarily the case, but just to realize that's the kind of thing they need. They need that. So if you have one that just has never bloomed for you, it may be the overall health of the plant, but it may be that it just never gets these differences in days. Now, I get mine to reflower, and they're here in my office. And I will tell you, it doesn't get down to 55 in here at night. And it's more into that, 65 at night, and then certainly probably more into the, probably not quite 80, but certainly it's warmer, certainly warmer during the day. So you get that kind of change. So just to realize that is one of the things you're going to have to think about if you do want these to get in flower. Again, you may just find you have to find in a certain spot where they'll get that change in daylight or change in temperature. And having them outdoors helps. You can get them sort of started on that, and you may find that it works out perfectly, sort of late summer, early fall, that the temperatures cooperate with us. So here you can see you're actually getting that flower stalk starting to come out. And the other thing to keep in mind is that once it starts to come out, it is, even though it looks really thick and it looks like you couldn't really do much, it is good time to go ahead and start staking the flower stalk. Now, do you have to? Well, no, not necessarily, but the show of flowers will be so much better. So if you get these little clippy things, and you can get them like at, I don't know, any of the drugstores or whatever in the hair supply area, you can find these little clippy things, and they work out really well for actually staking that flower stalk, so it'll stand up well for you, and you get a much better flower show. So this was one of mine that I had never staked. And you can see it's like everything's wrong with it, right? The roots are coming out, and you can see that I never staked it, and so the whole flower stalk, so you just don't get as good a show. So that's the big thing. Even though it flowered, and that's okay, it just really, can be better. Can certainly be much better. Now, when it comes to actually bloom failure, like why don't they bloom? So one of the things we've already certainly talked about is just not enough light. It's just the plant just isn't healthy enough. So it could be one of those things. You have it in north light, or has a really, really dark green color, or it's not growing very well. Just look at the leaves. It'll tell you whether it's not getting enough light. Again, back to that whole, maybe the night temperatures are just too warm. So, if you can put it in another part of the house or something like that, can help immensely. So really sort of think through those things. Is it growing well? Is it getting that change between night temperature and day temperature? And then just overall health, is it doing well for you? So it is one of those things, I know these can be very addictive once you start getting into this, is that and this was actually in Florida, and I was down there, and they really tempt you amazingly down there with all kinds of orchids. And I think moth orchids are just one of those. It's a good way to sort of get into orchids, and then you find that, maybe I can do this, maybe I really can do this, and you can get them into flower again. So these are just some additional resources that I've listed. I mentioned the American Orchid Society, and that's their website. They have lots of great information there, as well as some videos. And then certainly from there you can get to what your local orchid society might be, and then you can really start your addiction when they have their plant sales. A lot of them are having the orchid sales right now. When they have their plant sales, then you can really start getting in some other types of orchids. Either just a couple of the books that are out there that you may decide you want to go that route as well. And so it's just one of those things. I think it really is a good addiction, isn't it? I think gardening is a good addiction. And I just want to thank my orchid guru, Mitzi Williams. I've learned so much from her, and she walked me through actually, and she didn't grimace too much with all the mistakes I'd made, but she certainly helped. And I think that's one of the great things about gardening, isn't it? We learn from each other, and we find these folks that are just absolute gems that know so much about plants, orchids, whatever it might be. So I hope that's one of those things. This is my contact information. We certainly have some time here if people have some questions or comments or any kind of concerns that they might have, or want to talk a little bit more about maybe different types of questions they might have with orchids. So I'll open it up to questions here. And does anybody have any questions? So when double potting, does the plastic pot have drainage holes? Yes, absolutely. I don't know if I can take that back. But absolutely it does. And it actually has kind of slits. I don't know if I can find that picture right offhand, but they actually have little slits in them. And where can you find those clear orchid pots? That's another really good question. I have not found them regularly, like anywhere. So I actually either often you buy them and they're in those pots, and then you have them. Again, get with your local orchid society, and I almost bet somebody has those, or you may just have to order them online. I just haven't seen them available as regular, but it's those clear pots. So it's not, you certainly could use other plastic pots, but I think those clear pots just make all the difference in the world. And then what was it, orchid bath? An orchid bath. I don't know, that seems like a trick question, but what's an orchid bath? An orchid bath, I assume what they're saying is maybe you take your orchids and then wash them off periodically. Is that what they're thinking of? Because I think it is one of those things that sometimes it is kind of nice is just to go ahead and totally rehydrate them. If you really felt like the bark mix has gotten particularly dry, you may find you want to take the orchid plant pot and everything, put it in the sink and then wash off the whole plant. So maybe that's what they're thinking with orchid bath. And then do you remove the roots that have grown out of the pot when repotting? Oh, good question. Do you remove the roots that have grown out of the pot when repotting? No, not necessarily. So what you're going to do is you're going to take them out of the pot, and then, so don't cut off the roots. So that's perfect. Those are good roots, so don't come off of the pot. Just pull them out, pull it out of the pot, and then just go, again, sort of go through, rehydrate the roots, stick them in that water, and then start trimming off what's obviously dead, because that's the only thing that you really need to trim off. So anything that was outside the pot is going to end up, when you repot it, it's going to end up inside the pot, if that tells you anything. So hopefully that gives you a better idea. And had buds for a long time. It never bloomed. Would you know the reason? Well, the reason it never bloomed is probably, I would almost bet it's that lack of temperature difference. So they truly need that 15-degree difference between the daytime and the nighttime temperature. And if you have orchids in your home, you may find it's always pretty much the same temperature. So, and actually that's probably a good thing to do anyways, just to lower the temperature at night, or find another part of your house maybe that has a lower temperature, but I'd almost bet it's that difference in temperature. As far as propagation, again, I don't have much, I am, again, not the expert when it comes to propagating one, but moth orchids will sometimes actually produce a baby moth orchid on one of the stems. And so once in a while, it'll do it for you, but you really can't divide them or anything along those lines. Probably most of the time you're going to go ahead and purchase them, or, if somebody really wants to get into actually, crossing them and, getting all that. But I'm certainly not the expert on propagation stuff. It's not one that you're going to be able to divide. I have an orchid that I purchased at Kroger, and they watered it in the center, so 2 weeks later it rotted out. But I always saved it, and it grows sideways. It looks like there is two going sideways. One has bloom now, but should I separate them? So it looks like there's two orchids, it sounds like. So yes, I would pull the whole, it sounds like, especially if it's growing sideways, I would just pull the whole thing out of the pot, just gently pull it out of the pot, get it into, again, sort of some kind of container, and then wash them off really well. And then from there, you're going to easily tell whether there's two in there or not. And so you may be able to divide them at that point. I'm wondering if they didn't actually have two plants in there. And then you can repot it so it's right side up. Because if it's growing sideways, it's never going to be, So just don't worry about repot. Just repot them. This is a good time to go ahead and do that, but I would say any time's a good time to do that if they're not growing well. Do orchids get insect infestations? They can. They actually can get scale, and probably mealybug are probably the two that you might see. It gets really hard to control both of those insects. And so it's often one of those things that usually, and with these particular plants, usually just a good sanitation as you see that, you can usually wipe it off. And so just really watching the orchids and make sure you don't have that, or just as you repot them, then just really, really rinse them off really well, those kind of things. But those would probably be the two insects that you might end up getting. So it is one of those things that I think is just so much fun when it comes to these plants. And does anybody else have any other kind of questions that we might have? I mean, how can you go wrong? When you see a flower like that that's going to last for months, and you were the ones that got this plant back into flower, this plant that everybody else gave up on, you did it. Okay, if you have one that is blooming with 4 branches, should you cut 2 off? I would enjoy all the branches. 4 branches. No, you don't necessarily. If it has that many branching stems, that's wonderful. What I would probably do is, depending on whether you need to repot it or not, that would be the only time I'd really think about cutting them off, but just enjoy them. It is only 1 branch that then went to 4. Oh, it sort of branched off from there. Yeah, that's fine. So you don't necessarily have to do that, to go ahead and cut them off. It almost sounds like maybe it's been flowering a little bit too long, and that's kind of where I was with mine, was I was just letting them flower and flower and flower, and so it just seemed like they were all, it was getting to the point where the flowers weren't as big, and so I really did go ahead and I cut them off and then really repotted them and then waited for the new ones to come on, and then the flowers were just bigger. So I think you have to kind of decide on that, but it almost sounds like you've got maybe too many, it's been blooming too long. What's the lifespan for the moth orchid? I don't know. Good question. I don't know why you couldn't, one that you couldn't have for years and years and years and years. I don't know that. That's a really good question. But I think growing right, you can just keep repotting them and going from there. Will them to your, kids, your neighbor. I'm not sure I've ever heard of that before, but... So does anybody else have any other kind of questions when it comes to these plants? I hope you get a chance to, even if you just buy one, this is a one plant that I would say just buy one and flower and enjoy it. Even if you don't plan on getting it to reflower, you'll find that the flowers last so long. You will be well rewarded. And there's actually some minis now, some really small ones that easily will fit on your desk or your table or whatever, and you can look at them and enjoy just how beautiful these truly intricate flowers are. So any other questions? Well, I hope that's helped, and I hope you at least feel a little bit more confident that you can do some things with orchids, and certainly with moth orchids. And then when everybody is trying to get rid of theirs because they can't figure out how to get it to reflower, you're the one that's going to go ahead and take in all these wayward orchids and get them back into flower.
Sandy, there was one more question.
Oh, okay. When would you know if it's time to plant the new growth? When would you know if it's time to plant? I'm not sure I understand that question. When would you know if it's time to plant the new growth? I'm not sure I know. As in repot? Sorry, I don't know that. I don't understand the question. What can I expect for the cost of a typical orchid? Okay, so what can you expect for the cost? They are so inexpensive now. Again, it depends on what you're looking for. But for a lot of us, you may be able to go to some of the box stores and you might get a mini for like $10, and some of the bigger ones might be $20. And then, I've certainly paid more than that because of the bigger. Generally, the bigger the plant and the more flower stalks, the more expensive it's going to be. So that's probably the biggest thing. Is just decide from your own budget. The new baby orchid. When do you plant the baby orchid? Growing off a shoot. I think really once it starts to get some decent-sized roots, then you can go ahead and pot them. So really as it continues to grow, then you can go ahead and repot them. So any other questions? And actually, as far as the baby orchids and stuff, I would just go on. There's some decent videos on some of those, more intricate things. You may find that that's pretty helpful if you go to the American Orchid Society. Any other thoughts? Well, thank you all very much for joining me, and go forth and garden. That's my 2 cents. Thank you all.